Welcome. So I'd like to thank you all for coming to the annual Leo Panitch School Winter Lecture. This is our third year doing this since we launched the school. It is wonderful to see how it's grown and how many people are coming into contact with this programming, not just events like this, but also regular courses. And so it's been a really wonderful thing for us to do events like this for you all and to get people involved. So my name's Matt. I'm the coordinator of the school. That's the role I serve in currently. A little bit about it. The Leo Panitch School was founded in 2023 by members of the Socialist Project primarily. Socialist Project is an eco-socialist organization based here in Toronto. Through the Leo Panitch School, we're striving to provide radical, accessible, and practical educational programming for those seeking to better understand and address the crisis of our current times. So that's what we're trying to do here tonight in a particular way, I think. We'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Chippewa, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. While we must do more to just acknowledge, we're grateful to have the opportunity to gather and learn in this place. Further, we affirm the right of First Nations people to true national self-determination. We also believe that it's important to recognize the common struggles experienced by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous working people, as well as the ways in which capitalism relies on prejudice, exploitation, and oppression to keep us divided. We're very pleased tonight to have Nicole Aschoff with us to deliver a talk on the pressing issue of AI, automation, and workplace control. She's an educator, writer, and editor. She is also the author of Smartphone Society, Technology, Power, and Resistance in the New Gilded Age, and is currently publishing director at Verso Books. Joining Nicole on stage after her talk, we're going to have a bit of a sort of fireside chat, roundtable-ish, without the table, discussion with two discussants, and they also happen to be very good friends of mine. Tori Fleming is a PhD student at York University, as well as a member of the Socialist Project and the Canadian Union of Public Employees 3903. Her research focuses on Amazon's infrastructures of surveillance, where she analyzes the ways in which the surveillance of workers informs the surveillance of customers. Sam Gindin was research director of the Canadian Auto Workers, and he's also a member of the Socialist Project, retired member of the Socialist Project. He was the co-author with Leo Panitch of The Making of Global Capitalism, and also the co-author, again with Leo Panitch, as well as Steve Marr, of The Socialist Challenge Today, the expanded and updated American version out on Haymarket Books. After a bit of a chat with the three of them, we're going to also do our best to fit in a little bit of audience Q&A if we can. So think of questions you might have for these guys. Please, everyone, give a warm welcome to Nicole Aschoff.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Matt, for that lovely introduction. Matt also made this very nice flyer, which I'll talk about in a second. But also thanks to Tori and Sam and the Socialist Project for inviting me. I just wanted to say, so it's interesting, I actually met Sam at an event kind of like this in New York. If any of you were our fellow travelers who spent a lot of time in New York, there used to be something called the Brecht Forum. And I met Sam there for the very first time and accosted him after the talk. He was having a debate with Bob Brenner. But Leo, I actually met, so this was 18 years ago, I think. Leo, I actually met when I was just 20 years old at what used to be called the Socialist Scholars Conference. I was a very young person, also in New York, and Leo was giving a talk, and I worked up the courage to ask him a question afterward. And he was so gracious and talked to me for a long time and just really was willing to engage with my fumbling kind of questions about global geopolitics and history. And we went on to have a very long-standing, not as close as I am with Sam, but Leo was really someone who, I think influenced me profoundly in my own kind of intellectual development. And I also just really looked up to him as someone who maintained his integrity and passion and enthusiasm and hopefulness throughout his whole life, thinking about the possibilities for the left. So I really am so thankful to be speaking here in his memory and this amazing new project that you've started. So without further ado, I want to talk a little bit today about AI, and I think first I should explain this somewhat wonky sounding title. Work is something that I feel incredibly passionate about. I'm now back in publishing at Verso, but until 2 months ago or so, I was teaching in the labor studies department at UMass Boston, which is great, and I love my UMass Boston students, and I miss them. But more importantly, to me, work is something that is absolutely fundamental to our society. Fundamental as a place where value is created, but also where class is produced and reproduced, and where we see sort of the organizing principles of power and hierarchy in our society. But this question of control, I think, is interesting in this moment, particularly when we use words like the information age, or we think about digital technology, right? There's a sort of underlying sense of sort of control theory and the kind of digital logic, right? That's underwriting and reproducing and reorganizing the systems of our life, culture and ideas. But I think we, as socialists, think about control at work in a much more kind of fundamental way, right? Thinking about how this fight over control, right, really defines our society and really defines the possibilities for working people. And how control in this kind of information age, right, this digital age, operates in the workplace, right, is one of the defining kind of questions, right, both in terms of how working people can push back, how they can actually take control of some of these processes, and how companies like Amazon are actually using digital technology to increase the power of this kind of digital logic to reorganize our lives. The other two kind of words there that I want to talk about for a second. The first is this age of AI, right? And when you hear the word age, it has a sort of purportedly historical element to it, right? And we often hear about how this moment we are in a fundamentally new age, right? And it has sort of both spatial and temporal kind of elements, right? We're in a moment that we've never seen before, and we're exploring this kind of spatial frontier, the digital frontier, which is a place that we've never been before. But I would argue that the ways that we actually talk about AI, right, are a bit ahistorical, right? They don't actually draw on history to think about the roots of how automation, how digital technology are very long, right? And the framing of this moment as something profoundly new, that's partly true, but it's also partly ideological, right? And it actually, in some sense, is ahistorical. So I want us to dig into that a little bit today. And finally, this question of AI, right? Often, AI is kind of the subject of the sentence, right, that's doing the action. The way we frame AI as AI is going to do this, AI is causing this, as if it were sort of self-evidently a discrete thing outside of history, right, or outside of the kinds of social, political, economic processes that order the rest of our lives. And I think that this is a mistake, right, in the sense that it muddies our understanding of how to react and respond and fight back against some of these processes. I think that it's actually very convenient to use it in this kind of murky way for people who benefit from this kind of blanket AI will fix this. Oh, we'll use AI to do that later. But it also, I think, is a little bit dangerous or at least counterproductive, because when we frame AI as this all-powerful thing or unspecified thing, it can generate sort of a sense of fatalism, right? It allows kind of technologically determinist framings to take hold and to shape our responses, right? And to foster a bit of reactivity rather than strategic thinking, right, in building working class power. All right, this screen is a little bit small. Luckily, I mostly just have some photos, so it's okay. I just usually, especially when I'm teaching to my students, I like to throw photographs up there so they can have something to look at instead of just me. But we went from talking about something that seems very futuristic and high-tech, and here I'm showing you some very old photographs. So, why? Well, what I'm showing you actually here, and it's probably a little bit hard to see, but these are 3 photos from the 1945 to 1946 strike wave in the United States. And this was not a strike wave that was only in the United States. It actually, we saw a worldwide strike wave after World War II. But this, in the United States, it was huge, right? So why am I forcing you to think back to the 1940s? It's not because I want to romanticize that time period as this kind of heyday of labor, though we can talk a little bit about that. Instead, it's that, first of all, I think it's really important to situate kinds of struggles that workers are having to deal with automation and digital technology today in this much longer history, which this is a good place to start, though we could go back further, but also because the specific ways that employers responded to this strike wave actually are directly related to how we are using digital technology in the workplace to control workers today. So the strike wave, many of you know this, so I'll just say a few things about it. Millions of workers walked off the job at the end of World War II, right? And the picture in the middle is actually the Oakland general strike. So it wasn't just workers who were, walking out over wages and working conditions. There was a sense of a much broader, more radical kind of project, right, in this kind of moment. So why were workers walking out? Obviously, they wanted a wage increase. There were real tensions about integrating soldiers coming home back into the workforce, fights over who was allowed to have jobs. But they were also walking out because work had been degraded over the years. So you saw increasing alienation. And there really was a sense in this particular moment that workers wanted to fight for what Nelson Lichtenstein has called industrial democracy, right? The right not just for higher wages or a shorter workday, but to actually have control over the labor process, right? To have control over the conditions of work, maybe even what types of things you produced and how you produce them, right? This idea that the principles of democracy should be extended into the workplace, right? Which was really something, it's hard to imagine that now, but that was really something that was on the table, right? This loss of control from the perspective of capital, right, from the perspective of management, when you have millions of workers walking off the job in these years, was intolerable, right? We had seen, yes, a long history of automation, right? The 30s in particular, you watch some of these old movies that General Motors put out of the production process. It's incredible, the automation then that was already in play, right? We see the trends that Braverman talked about, right? The separation of tasks, the degradation of work already. But even with this fine-grained division of labor, workers still had the power to stop production, to control how fast the machines were going, particularly skilled workers, right? And this massive walkout really seemed to capital to be a moment where they had lost control of the factories. Now, we can say whether that was true or not, whether it was an inflated sense of the dangers of workplace democracy, but that was certainly the perspective at the time. This was seen as a loss of control of production. So, how does capital respond? How do business owners respond? Well, they respond in a number of ways, right? There's a crackdown. Again, we think about this period as one of sort of like extreme labor power, right? We had a period when unions were actually kind of junior partners, but they had a seat at the table. And this is relatively true, right? But one of the things that we tend to do is to forget how hard and how steadily business owners fought back against any gains that were made by organized labor. They never gave up, right? And there were a whole host of ways that business owners fought back and management fought back. So it's a little bit hard to see here, but I'll just give you a little bit of a sense of them. So the first one on the top left is time and motion studies, right? Basically saying, let's use science to rationalize the production process even more, de-skill it even more, right? To separate skill from management, right? Of course, the top right is the Taft-Hartley Act, which is a sort of political response to weaken, in the United States, to weaken the power of organized labor by regulating what activities they are allowed to engage in. The bottom left is the Red Scare, right? One of many Red Scares, but this in particular, we saw the removal of militant organizers, of communist organizers from unions, right, which has an extremely detrimental effect on solidarity, right, on the sort of creativity of those movements. The bottom right, that's just a picture of the UAW, but what I'm getting at there is this imposition of rigid grievance procedures, right? This sort of introduction of rigidity within the union process, right? Actually using labor leaders to tame the labor movement through really strict contracts, right? Through these kinds of grievance procedures. But right in the middle, okay, I put this picture. This is from 1960, but right in the middle, I put this picture of a machine from a General Electric plant in Lynn, Massachusetts. And General Electric instituted one of the projects that they did, including all of these other things, was to institute a process called numerical control, right? Which was essentially part of their vision of the automatic factory. And the idea, and they worked closely with MIT engineers and the Air Force, right? They received, this was almost all publicly funded. The idea was that they would make machines that could think. This was the vision, okay? And so they would create these giant machines that would use punch tapes, okay? And they would be fed in. The punch tapes would be made by scientists. And the idea was that low-skilled machinists, low-paid machinists could operate the machines. And they would just sort of plug them in and push the button, and the machine tool would magically come out, right? The idea was, at last, right, we would be able to get rid of the power of skilled workers, okay? I put these together because these were all part of the crackdown, all right? And already, this idea of using this kind of digital automation was there as part of the process to control labor, as part of the process to erode militancy and to control the labor process, to control the workforce. And I think it's really important for us to put it in that context, right? It's not something that's apart from all of these other kinds of strategies that companies using, or part of these other struggles that workers are workers are dealing with to try to increase their power in the factory. Okay, so where are we then? So I put this picture of you. Any Vonnegut fans out there? Have any of you read the Red Player Piano? How many of you read it? Okay, a couple. All right, well then I will just say. So Kurt Vonnegut, this was his first novel in 1952. A lot of it came out in 1952. Oh, I better hurry up. Thanks, Matt. It's a novel about the very near future after World War II, in which machines have been created that can produce everything that society needs, and pretty much there's no more need for people to work. The few jobs that are left over, people are either in the military or they work in the Reeks and Recs, which is like the public works department. Kurt Vonnegut was actually a PR guy for General Electric. And if you read Player Piano and you read about the General Electric's numerical control program, that's where he got all the material for the novel, which is fascinating. The reason why I'm bringing this up, it's not one of Vonnegut's best novels, though I do like it, is that I think it's there's a couple reasons. One is that it shows us that this idea of automation, right? The idea of automatic control, or the sort of a factory without workers. The story of that is incredibly important. But also, the story that Vonnegut creates, right, is one in which institutions, okay, in this case the military and corporations and social groups, and particularly the power of an ideology of technological progress is central, right? And I think a lot of what we see today is that the story of AI is as important as the kind of processes, the ways that AI is actually being used, right? And we really have to make a distinction. But also, that if we're really going to talk about any kind of technology, we have to embed it into these broader ideas and interests and priorities. We have to actually understand it in the realm of class conflict. We have to understand it in this system of power and take seriously the kind of ideology that's shaping how we use this technology. Okay, so what does that mean practically in this moment, right? Because I think one of the things that we often really feel compelled, because every day we read a story about AI, right, in some realm or another. It's impossible to read the newspaper without reading a story about AI. But it's often sort of left ill-defined, right? So I think one of the most important things for us to do, particularly when we're thinking about things like ChatGPT and roboticization and, artificial general intelligence, right? Jeff Hinton won the Nobel Prize this year. He's often thought of as the father of AI, right? What do we actually need to think about in this moment, right? To better understand, all right, if we're in the context of work, right? How do we actually think productively? So, Jason Resnikoff, and there are a number of articles, but I pulled this up there. He wrote a really nice, short piece in the New Labor Forum last year. And he quotes Margaret Bowden, because when we say, okay, what actually is artificial intelligence? And she says, AI is the practice of making computers do the sorts of things that minds do, right? So it's not a specific technology. Right? People who actually work in the fields of machine learning and physics and software engineering, computer science, they don't refer to AI as this kind of discrete thing outside of history, right? It's a number of different practices. It's not one specific technology, right? And I think we should go even further than that, right? When we start to say, well, what do you mean by AI? And when we're asking how it's actually used, well, the ways that I think it's really productive for us to think about it, particularly in the context of work, is to, as I was saying earlier, put it in this broader historical trajectory of automation, right? To put it into this long process of automation with in which artificial intelligence is actually part of that process, right? To look at the ways that these models and software are used as part of that process, right? And to understand the decisions that employers are making, right, to be as part of that process, rather than seeing it as this kind of discrete thing. And I put, last year was the 50th anniversary of Labor and Monopoly Capital by Braverman. And one of the reasons why we ended up having me come up here was because I wrote a review of a book about connective labor, and I was really sort of emphasizing the need to revisit Braverman. So if any of you are actually thinking about the labor process in the present moment, I highly suggest you start with Labor and Monopoly Capital. Because one of the most brilliant things about the book is that he really digs into this long process of separating and pulling out the skill of workers, right? And separating out tasks to degrade work, right? And to control the labor process in a way that allows management to organize tasks and takes power away from workers to actually control their own work, right? And to actually maintain their skills, to maintain the craft that they have. The ways that artificial intelligence is used today fits neatly in this long historical trend, right? One of the reasons why this is hard to see is because we very much are caught up in the ways that we talk about artificial intelligence and automation in a kind of technologically determinist framework, right? Many of the articles that we read really suffer from this framing immediately as AI is the subject, or as machines are organizing society rather than people, right? And it's like, yes, very obvious when we say that, but it's an extremely common way to frame both problems and solutions. And so I think we need to get away from that. And even more specifically, right? Now let me just back up for 1 second. This is not to say that all of the ways that artificial intelligence is being used, right, is just like automation. Jeffrey Hinton gave an interview, just because I mentioned him earlier, with the New York Times in which he expressed deep fears about artificial intelligence. And I share some of those fears, particularly with regard to the ways that AI is used in the military capacities, right? Or the use of AI to start making decisions, right, in institutions. And that's something that Hinton talked about. Those things are things that we need to take very seriously. But when we're thinking about work, right, I really think it's important to be specific, right, and to actually think constructively, and in some ways, in a very straightforward way, ask questions about, okay, instead of just saying AI is going to replace all workers, right? Instead to say, all right, let's actually look at workplaces and ask ourselves, how and why is AI being used to restructure work? And I threw these, I'll just say some of these too, because it's probably a little bit hard for you to see. These are just some how and why answers that I thought up. They are not the only ones. You can probably think of some yourself, right? And they're definitely not mutually exclusive, and we can start thinking about them in relation to different examples. So I put replacement, right? These are the sort of how and why. Surveillance, de-skilling, misclassification, ideology, extraction, in the sense of like extracting more work, more value from your workers, deunionization, fishering, which is, if any of you have ever read any of the work by David Weil, right, he talks about fishering as a way of breaking up workplaces and industries so that basically the owners and managers of those companies can subcontract out and reduce their own responsibility and make money from just the highest value nodes. Rationalization and discipline, right? Now, this is sort of very straightforward. We went from thinking about AI as this kind of futuristic thing to thinking about, okay, some of these are very familiar, right? And we can imagine these as processes that management and companies are engaged in that maybe don't have anything to do with AI, right? Or we can think about them just in the history of restructuring work or the history of automation. But let's think about the first one first, right? Replacement. This is the primary thing that we're told all the time that is going to happen, right, as a result of AI. And if we think about something like ChatGPT replacing lawyers, right, there is a chance that that will happen, right? But just as I think that is definitely something that we should think about, much more likely is that artificial intelligence will be used to degrade work, right? And to actually increase the control that management has over the workplace, right? So something like extraction and surveillance, right, and discipline. Here we can imagine this in innovations like Uber for nurses, right? We're thinking about how nurses are being surveilled and managed by a platform on their phone and de-skilled, right? We're not getting rid of nurses, but we're actually degrading the quality of their work using these tools, these tools. And so I put on the bottom here these other, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, but rather than just replacement, the ways that AI is used, the how and the why, is really about exploitation in the kind of Marxian sense, control, and degradation, right? And the key word there is to restructure work, right? Not to replace workers. There will be some replacement, but the key is really restructuring. So I'm taking too much time here, Matt. I'll try to be quick. So, okay. A couple examples here of thinking about, all right, so how have workers actually responded, right? I have a couple examples here coming from unionized workers, okay? Workers who are not union, it's usually a sort of exit voice kind of trade-off, right? Which exit is the strategy that's most common. But I could put a couple other examples up here. The first one is just the GE Lin example that I mentioned earlier. Well, lo and behold, the automatic factory was a fantasy. The tape machines didn't work, and the company was losing millions of dollars and making huge piles of scrap metal. So they needed their machinists to actually get on board. They started a pilot program in the late 1960s that worked really well, and it was a sort of worker-led program that reduced scrap, increased profitability. This was a sort of, wow, if we could control technology, this would be kind of great, and this is how we should do it. GE scrapped the program because they were concerned by how much power their skilled machinists were developing as a result of it, right? So that's one example. The second kind of example to think about how workers respond to automation, right, to give us some ways of thinking about responding to AI, is the UAW, right? So automation introduced into assembly plants over time. The way that the union responded to that was to try to make deals with management through their sectoral, through their pattern bargaining agreements to say, all right, well, for every worker that goes out, you have to promise to replace a new one, and we will agree to concessions if you do that, right? The Detroit automotive companies agreed with these. You had generations of concessionary bargaining. The workforce dwindled. The unionized auto workforce dwindled. And this was not a strategy that ended in anything other than a tiered workforce and basically two folks working side by side on the assembly line and one being paid double what the other one was. All right. This example, this is a strike that happened in 2023, the SAG-AFTRA strike. This is probably something we might remember. And this was a strike that was very much about AI, right? It wasn't just about AI, though, right? It was about the restructuring of the industry for writers and for actors as a result of many things, but most importantly, the sort of entry of big asset management firms and venture capitalists into Hollywood and television, right, which restructured, destroyed the writing room, made it impossible for actors and writers to get royalties, coupled with the possibility that AI could be used to create things like digital replicas to put actors out of work, right? So this was very specifically, this strike, about attacking this problem of AI to replace workers, right? And this was interesting because there was a victory, right? A very small victory, but a sort of wedge into the issue to say, okay, we will limit the number of digital replicas that can be used and to make some inroads into kind of restoring the writer's room and of the past. So maybe some lessons there. And then finally, I picked this picture here of Uber drivers, Uber and Lyft drivers in Massachusetts. Last year, we had a very interesting case. Basically, Uber and Lyft around the United States have been using the ballot process to pass preemptive measures to make it so that Uber and Lyft drivers can never be classified as employees. Well, Massachusetts has very strong, at least on the books, laws about who can be misclassified as an independent contractor, right? And so our Attorney General, who's now our governor, sued these companies to say, you are breaking our laws, right? By misclassifying these workers as independent contractors. Well, behind the scenes, last summer, they came to a deal, an agreement, which essentially said Uber and Lyft drivers, not delivery drivers, just drivers for transportation network companies, could get a minimum wage of about $32 an hour, a few extra rights about things like getting deactivated, but they essentially kept the work process exactly the same, where your phone is your boss, and they didn't change the classification of these workers. They remain independent contractors, okay? So there's a real fight amongst organized labor about whether this was a good solution, right? Whether this is a solution to this kind of automation problem that we should be extending to everyone. And we can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A. All right, so, sorry. Thinking strategically a little bit here. I think one of the key things for us to really make a distinction, particularly in this audience, right, is we can think about, okay, what should workers do, working people, both in unions and outside of unions, but also how should we be thinking about this problem as socialists, right? Because I don't think that these are necessarily the same. We can be a worker and a socialist at the same time, right? But the scale is also different, right? So thinking about this fight in terms of workers, right? It's very clear that unions and workers should be fighting to improve their control at work, their control over the labor process, control over the quality of their work. But there are real barriers, particularly in places like the United States, right, as a result of sort of organizing laws and environment and the norms of organizing and the laws that actually limit how easy it is to unionize, right? But this fight to control the labor process remains extremely important. As socialists, I think our task is a little bit different, right? In the sense that I think attacking the kind of ideology of technological progress is really important, in the sense that we can't be afraid to call out these kinds of changes that are happening and say that this is not what we want, right? We have to question what the consensus of progress is and really ask progress for whom, right? Whose priorities are shaping these changes, right? Whose priorities are being considered? Whose interests are being considered, right? And to not be worried about appearing anti-progress. This is really something that happened in the auto industry, right? Auto workers were very afraid of appearing to be against progress, and we see the long-term effect of that. By the same token, I think it's really important for us to see the limitations of unions, not because unions are bad, but because they're structurally limited in how far they can actually take us in attacking some of these questions. And why? It's because their unit of analysis is the workplace, right? It is the labor process. Whereas we as socialists can think about the position of work in determining our livelihoods and say, maybe we want to actually weaken the power of that, right? Through processes of decommodification, right? Through processes of democratization, to actually to take away the all-consuming power of our employment status to determine our quality of life, right? To actually dilute the power of some of these technological changes by fighting for things that will take out of the market our right to healthcare, our right to education, our right to a home, right? Which these are the things that we've been fighting for as socialists, but they're actually more important rather than less important in this age of AI. So I went over, Matt, I'm sorry, I promised I wouldn't. I will stop there. But thank you very much, and yeah.
Okay, so to structure this discussion a little bit, I did develop 3 questions, which you touched on a lot of them during your fantastic lecture. It was truly great. The first one the first question I have for you is like, often or systems of AI are described as being like without any kind of labor. They're laborless, both in terms of how they're made and how they're used. And I'm wondering, like, what are some ways you think we can push back against this specific kind of framing of AI? And I'm thinking about this in relation to Amazon in particular. So if I refer to Amazon a lot, that's just the nature of doing my PhD on it. So it's what I'm thinking about the most, so my apologies in advance. But I think about this in terms of surveillance and AI systems broadly, where in Amazon, for example, the fulfillment centers are organized according to what's referred to as a chaotic organization. And what that essentially means is that all commodities on different rows and shelves are always different. You'll never find the same commodity next to each other in how Amazon organizes their warehouses. And so what happens is that when Amazon workers come into work at the fulfillment centers, they carry these GPS devices with them that essentially orient and direct their work, because it's only through this form of algorithmic management and control that the warehouse in general is becomes comprehensive or clear to workers, right? And so what happens there is the data that's extracted from workers, every single movement and gestures while they're working in the warehouse is extracted from them through these GPS devices, and then are reintegrated back into the production process through the reorganization of warehouses to make those warehouses more productive, the labor that happens in those warehouses more productive. So Amazon's artificial intelligence systems are deeply comprised of Amazon workers' daily movements and gestures, like alongside of many other types of data that they extract from other people. So that was just an example that I thought I would share in terms of your thoughts on how we can start putting labor back into how we understand AI.
No, I think that's, Tori, I think that's one of the clearest examples, right? The sense of, well, we're always generating data, even just when we're walking around with our phones, right? We're constantly generating data about ourselves and our preferences and our habits. And this actual work that's being done, then being used to refine the systems, I think is key. There are many ways that you can think about it. You know, even the labor, the labor of children who are using, you know, Khan Academy in the classroom, right? Or using these tools that are being developed to replace teachers, right? The constant testing that students are doing. Like, this is all being used then to retrain these guides, right? But you can also think about it in terms of the ways that labor is being used to, like AI is a story that's told that hides very low tech labor that is used to create, either to train the models that are being used or to actually do and there are really funny kind of examples of, you know, surveillance workers in the Philippines actually doing the work that, you know, companies like Amazon are saying that they're actually doing through technology. It's actually just being done by workers in another country. So yeah, I think that there are a lot of ways, like Uber drivers, right? The sort of gamification to see how hard they can push these drivers, right? And to actually use the ways that drivers respond to these signals to then refine the app to get them to stay in the car longer, to drive longer. I think that that's a really great point.
Yeah, and I think part of the way I think about this too is just like all of the labor that goes into making these systems even function, right? Which goes as far as like resource extraction in mostly African or Latin American countries, to the invisibilized like ghost workers that make data legible or machine readable, to people who have to like maintain the data centers that exist. Like there's such a significant amount of labor that goes into maintaining these systems broadly that are just like completely erased in most discourses about AI. I don't know if you want to say something, Sam?
I like this going.
One other thing, and this is a mistake we always make too, is we just talk about the sort of downstream labor, but all of the upstream labor that goes into the actual extraction and creation of the hardware, right? And the building of these, the cloud doesn't exist in the air. It's like it's a huge infrastructure, right? And so all of the labor that goes into that, and into the creation of these devices that are then used to track and exploit labor to a greater degree here. There's all that upstream labor as well, which is minimized or hidden. I think that's also really important.
Yeah, for sure. Do you want to say something? Keep going. Okay. So it does lead into another question I have for you. So I was recently rereading Larry Lohman's essay in the Socialist Register about AI, and he makes the statement that instead of referring to AI as artificial intelligence, which anthropomorphizes the term and actually like obscures what it's doing, we should be referring to AI as both like the mechanization of interpretive work or as interpretation machines, because that's getting more at what AI is actually doing, as you were talking about earlier, as the techniques and practices that constitute AI. But it also demonstrates that AI is developing out of the division of labor. And he speaks about it in relation to how Marx spoke about the steam engine in the Industrial Revolution, where it wasn't actually the Industrial Revolution wasn't spurred on by the invention of the steam engine, but rather came out of the expansion of the division of labor that then required the need for a machine to be able to coordinate the mass amount of labor that was being orchestrated and controlled simultaneously. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were on this way of thinking about AI.
Yeah, I'd have to think about that a little, Tori, but I think we have to be very careful, as you're suggesting there, not to be sort of technologically determinist, but also to understand how technology then can be used in ways that is like unexpected and that it wasn't intended for, right? The sort of outcomes, and partly by the ways that people actually use machines, right? But also just in the ways that we organize work, which, as you said, makes the need for machines that we didn't necessarily see before. So I think it's this interplay over time. But I think, as you're saying, right, locating it in this kind of longer history of work is essential to understanding it. And it's when we take it outside and talk about it as if it's an age that has no precedent that we actually lose sight of some of these insights. So I think that thinking about that interplay is really important and super interesting.
Yeah, no, and I like that you brought up Braverman, because like he does talk about the fragmentation of work processes in order to like both de-skill work itself, but also then through de-skilling creating the opportunity for automation to step in and do some of that work as well. But I think it's also useful to highlight the other process that's happening at the same time as work is being de-skilled, which is like the centralization of knowledge within the hands of management or corporations, which I feel like we see very directly with artificial intelligence, where it's really only a few private companies that own and operate these broad AI systems that are being integrated in like so many different aspects of our life. And we, that obviously leads to questions about democratic control and everything like that. But it also leads to, I guess, which will be the last question that I have for you, and then Sam, this is the quietest I've ever seen you. So, so my last question kind of pivots to the questions of the environment and thinking about how do we what sorts of political programs should we be working on with unions and socialist parties to try to discourage the notion of AI pushing us outside of resolving in some kinds of ways the climate crisis that we're experiencing. And I don't just mean this from the perspective that AI is like incredibly resource and energy intensive, which I'm sure everybody here knows. And also there is a limit to the amount of like rare minerals that can be extracted to make the very machines that we need in order to make AI systems work. But more so pointing to the role that AI is playing in making like capitalist accumulation continuously occur, and how now it's become a constitutive element of the reproduction of capitalism itself. And I find that that aspect of AI is not spoken about very much, but how can we start pushing different unions and socialist parties, perhaps one day the Socialist Party here may do that too, to considering like the central role of AI in reproducing capitalism. Sorry, these are very heady questions I developed for you.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think one of the dangers of AI is that it's, when we have these models and we have these programs, they have the kind of intention written into them, right? And that is the only thing that's considered, sort of the goal of to produce this most efficiently or produce this at the least cost, right? Which by definition, because it's just a program or a machine, doesn't take into consideration, Sam and I were talking about this earlier, any of the sort of complex externalities at play, right? Any of the kinds of social relationships that are impacted by this decision-making loop that's over and over. And so I think what we have to do as socialists, right, is to remember that, sort of human labor and people are at the center of our society. And when we decide how we want to organize our society, rather than allowing this kind of technologically determinist framing to be setting priorities and setting pathways of development, we can push back and actually say, no, we have to actually take these externalities seriously in how we're planning. And there is obviously a role for automation and digital technology, of course, but to not allow this kind of muddiness and fear of being labeled anti-progress to get in the way of actually saying, no, we need to set the priorities for ourselves. We need to set our goals when it comes to climate change and to actually be very clear about the resource intensity that's involved in the kinds of digital advances that we're making, and really ask, like, what are the priorities? What are the goals of those projects? Like, and how are they actually mostly just underwriting a kind of capitalist profit-making scheme rather than the things we really need to improve our everyday lives? So that's, I don't know if that really answers your question, but.
No, I mean, definitely points to a direction I think we need to take when thinking about these like technologies. It's your turn now.
I was hoping we'd run out of time. No, I really love the exchange, and I think that Tori and Nicole have thought about this a lot more than I have. So I want to say a couple of quite general things, which I think reinforce what you were going at in your talk earlier, and then return to the question of unions, which I want to say some more things about. What strikes me, and I don't feel very literate on the AI question, but what strikes me is that what most people want to talk about is to speculate on what's going to happen to them. What most people want to talk about is to speculate on what's going to happen to them. Am I going to lose my job? This is a threat. And what they don't want to talk about, they've been moved off of talking about, is a sense of the radical ways you could use technology. Like, why isn't it liberating us, actually? Why isn't it giving us time? Why isn't it improving the quality of work? Or why aren't the engineers focusing on how could technology make the work better, or deal with health and safety issues? Or why is so much of it linked to the military instead of the environment and medical care? And why aren't we distributing the benefits if they're so good? Why isn't that happening? Especially in terms of, you raised the question of the global south. Why aren't we just transferring this technology if it's so reproducible? And the reason is that it depends. All these questions depend, and we're not talking about what it depends on, which is, I think, the main thrust of what Nicole was trying to say. It's this outside force. And the critical question is to recognize it as a social relation. And it's a relationship of power. And that's the question we have to get at. Now, in terms of workers, we tend to think of capitalism as already being here, but it's still developing. And a crucial part of capitalist developing is the creation of a workforce and a working class that fits into their needs. So what we're seeing is the commodification of labor hasn't already happened. It's still happening. It's still happening by fragmenting it even more. And ideologically, the power is to get the technologies to become a common sense reality of our lives that we just have to cope with. And once that gets into your head, it's hard to fight an enemy that's inside your head. And so the ideological question is really important. So I want to say a couple of things about unions and then hand it back to you so I can start learning more things from you. One thing about unions is that, aside from everything that capital has done to unions, one of the things that unions don't talk enough about, and those of us who are supporters of unions have to raise ourselves and not skip over, is that unions have retreated from the workplace. The institutionalization of unions meant that unions traded off their working conditions for wages. That was the trade-off, not control. The most important thing for capital isn't just profits, it's control, so you can sustain those profits. But workers have moved away from the workplace, and that affects everything. Once you move away from the workplace, people aren't engaged in any mass way. They wait to vote on a contract in 4 years. They maybe strike once in their lives. Few workers would strike more than twice in their lives. They're not fighting things on a daily basis like working conditions and management control. And therefore, they're in no position to actually take on the question of power. Never mind the bigger questions, but just take it on inside the workplace by fighting over those questions of using technology in a completely different way. And they're very concrete ways that you can think about. Time off the job, the distribution of benefits, bringing the engineers in and telling them to redesign things so that the work is easier or better, the quality of life, etc. And we shouldn't start off by thinking, well, the reason for that is unions are, the structure of production is so inherently weak. There's actually more capacity to disrupt than there has ever been. The whole point about supply chains when they send out this stuff is when somebody sends the brakes out to another contractor's, you can shut the brakes down, you can shut down 4 assembly plants instead of just the assembly plant. You can interrupt. When computers were just coming in and they were still had the electric cables, somebody had complained about the fact that workers were being treated badly by the foreman. And another worker said, well, what did you do about it? He says, well, what could I do? I'd get fired. I probably went, I tried to punch the foreman out. And he said, did you think of cutting the cable that went to the computers? And don't brag about it. Don't run around saying you did it. And then maybe next time it happens again the same way, maybe they'll get the message. Now, it's not the point about the specific tactic. It's just the point about the fact that workplaces are complex things. They depend on workers. They depend on all kinds of things happening. And creatively, you can disrupt. And the power of workers that's so critical is this ability to disrupt in the workplace. And you can't do that unless you're constantly organizing in the workplace, which means fighting over working conditions. If you're sitting there waiting and people aren't active daily, you don't have that power. And then you get to the main question, I think that, that Nicole was getting at the end. There's only so far you can go in the workplace. The workplace is a limited site of power. You can do things. You can resist. You have to resist because that's the start of doing bigger things. But this is about power in society. So it means that we can't address this question without actually talking about socialism. I mean, if we give up on controlling investment and technologies, this is what's going to happen to us. We're going to sit around waiting to see where it goes. And we're not in a position to take power right now, but we have to start thinking about that now. It's the only way that it can happen. And and it does mean, I'll say a larger thing maybe. We need to transform unions because unions are so important, not just for the workplace, but in society as a whole. I'm very skeptical of unions transforming themselves through an internal process. I think it will take a socialist party with their feet inside the unions and their feet outside to transform the unions so that unions can actually become the kind of institution that struggles to change technology inside the workplace and struggles to make the external changes that we need. So, a criticism of unions in this regard is important as part of our support for unions. We don't do unions a favor by not criticizing them. They have to change, and there has to be that kind of intelligent response to that. I do want to say, just from my own experience, one of the powerful things that Braverman says in his book is he emphasizes the importance of control. It's not just that corporations want profits. And there are all kinds of examples in the auto industry where there were things that the corporations could have done that would have increased their profits, but it would have meant handing some control over to workers indirectly, and they absolutely understood that and avoided that. So the question of power and control is absolutely fundamental.
I agree. Matt, how are we doing? It's difficult to teach because the students are using like AI tools. Yeah, I mean, this is a conversation that I had with my colleagues every single week. And one of the ways that we do it is just to bring everything back into a sort of analog classroom model. Like I went back to having in-class exams, much to the anger of my students. We do in-class writing assignments. And we also think about, well, look, we can't pretend that this technology doesn't exist, so it's constantly adapting, right? But I think it's also fighting back against the sort of fatalism that comes along with the technology and really having conversations. I think you have to have conversations with your students and see where they're at. And it depends, students are different at every level, right? And so the strategies for teachers have to be different at every level. But really it's also about teachers have to be able to organize with each other, right? To actually make policy in their universities rather than allowing sort of, tech companies or investors or people who want to bequeath the university a gift of money, but then I'm being very cryptic here, but then to actually sort of encourage the use of that kind of technology in the classroom, right? So it's part of it is sort of maintaining and increasing control over the labor process, but also really working with your students and adapting. But that's not a very concrete question because it's ongoing, right? It's a really big challenge that I don't necessarily have the answer for.
I think the point about education is crucial. I mean, if you really have a different notion of what your social values are and what you're trying to do, it's got to affect the school system. And that's one of the things that's important. But not just the school system, training generally. We were doing some training with auto workers on technology, and they were very resistant to the technology. They felt intimidated by it. And it was working on computers. And what the people we had that were working on this, what they did was they brought in computers and people took them apart. And they learned how they work. They didn't tell them which button to choose. They took them apart. And what people learned is that these are machines. And they can be put together and they can be used for different purposes. And that was a really important lesson. The companies found out that once workers did this, they really loved it. They could talk to their kids about what computers were, and they were more confident in accepting other technologies. They actually became more open than resistance. And then they discovered that, but wait a second, this starts raising questions of control and confidence. And they dropped the idea, even though it was actually helping them with the training. And I mean, that's a critical thing. I mean, these are machines that can be used in different ways, depending on social relations. In Chile, before Allende was thanks, Shus. In Chile, before Allende was overthrown, they were working on trying to figure out computers that instead of just being about centralizing information, collecting information from people passively, and then centralizing it and using it the way you wanted, could you set this up so what it was doing is providing people with the maximum amount of information? And what would that mean? And what would that mean in the school system? What would that mean how we'd be trained to use these things? So, everything comes back to the fact that these are machines. They can be used in good ways. They can be used in bad ways. It's about power and social relations. I just want to say one other thing because of an argument I'm always having with my son. And I think he may be right, but I just want to flag it as a question to both of you too. One of the questions you come up to always when you do this kind of historical argument, and I talk about my experience as an old man, is that I'm told that, yeah, but this time it's different. And it's a very hard argument to make. And I don't think I understand enough about the actual technology to argue it. So my response is always like, yeah, it may be different, but that makes it all the more important because we don't actually know how far it can go to control it and to learn it. But that doesn't quite answer, people who say, well, we're stuck with it now. How different is it going to be? And, Nicole was arguing that it's going to be different along a lot of measures. Maybe not just replacing everybody, but all the things you raised at the end. It's going to restructure our lives. And how do we deal with it? So I just wanted to know whether you guys wanted to comment on this question of this time it's different.
Well, I'm not going to comment on that one quite yet, but to Tanner's question, I think when we're talking about AI, we're talking about a specific type of AI that's produced within specific social relations, as Sam has said. And this isn't even in terms of like what AI is developed to do and how it's implemented and all of these things. But I think we also need to like peel back the logic that's built within AI and how AI systems are intended to make sense of people and places in the world generally. And like, for example, like psychometrics is one of the leading ways in which AI systems like make meaning. So psychometrics being like the statistical evaluation of human capacity, right? Which is oriented around very, what's the word I'm looking for? Reductive notions of things like intelligence. Psychometrics actually comes out of the eugenics movement and all of these sorts of things. So this type of logic is deeply embedded in how these types of AI systems are making sense of the world around us. And I think that is something we really need to contend with when we're talking about alternative uses with this specific type of artificial intelligence. I don't know if you want to talk about Sam's question.
Actually, Tori, I want to just build a little bit on what you just said, because I think that's so important. And it gets to both the sort of planning debates and this question of can AI be used for good, or can it be used for our project? It is true in some sense, it's like, yes, it is a machine, and if we get out of this technologically determinist framework, then we can say, then yes, it's a machine that we can ascribe our own priorities and goals to use, right? That's true as far as it goes. But what Tori is saying about the sort of logic that is inherent in the creation of the particular programs and models, but also if we look at like the specific labor process that's involved, right, in many of these, the ways that we organize production can also engender social relationships that can be quite hierarchical or oppressive, right? When we think about, Lenin was really impressed with Taylor. He thought that this idea of organizing the factory along these kind of assembly line model was great. It's like, if you just have a worker state instead of being owned by the capitalist, all your problems will be solved. When actually, the ways that you organize production are extremely important to the social relationships that emerge, right? So these are questions. None of that is to say, no, we can't use this technology, but there are also, you have to think about these factors, including, for example, like the extremely extractive nature and energy-intensive nature of all of these AI systems. Like, this is also not something that we can escape, particularly when we're thinking about the constraints that climate change is imposing on our struggle. Like, that also has to be part of it, right? We cannot just say, well, if it's just being used for good, right? We have to actually have a more kind of nuanced approach. But go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, I think one of the things I said isn't quite right, and I just want to correct it. The idea that machines can be used for different things does have a limit, because there's a history of why certain machines have been developed and others haven't. The point I was really trying to make is about technology. There's all kinds of machines we haven't invented because no one's been interested and had the money to do them. So one of the questions is, under a different set of social relations and a different attitude to what work must mean, we'd be inventing different kinds of machines that you can't just adjust existing machines to be.
I would say we need to always remember that AI is making predictions based off of data that's inherently from the past, right? So all of these future predictions are actually deeply oriented around past behavior and past moments or past pieces of data that have been accumulated. So from that perspective, I feel like we should actually start challenging like the futuristic orientation of AI's predictions, because it is so rooted in in past data and just like the history of data that has been produced. So that severely constrains the kinds of outputs that will come from the kinds of predictions that data will, or that AI systems will make for us. In terms of absolving ourselves of responsibility of the kinds of predictions that emerge out of AI, I mean, I can't really predict that for you. I could see definitely, that inflaming the sense of AI as this like autonomous agent that's dictating our lives rather than actually being deeply rooted in the institutions that are producing and using these AI systems, right? So that would be, I think, a way of trying to get around it, but I do find it a little difficult to predict the narratives that will come out of decision-making from AI systems. That being said, I think we should be deeply concerned with the integration of AI within certain kinds of decision-making, mostly oriented around like policy, which could go to a foreign policy perspective as well if we're thinking about geopolitics, and just asking ourselves, okay, what kind of information and what kind of inferences are being made from the data that's being extracted to orient future policy, right? Like, and how is that accessible to the public? And where is that data coming from? Those are all the questions that I think we should be asking ourselves and can orient like political campaigns around the use, like protesting against the use of data or of AI systems in decision making, because it usually is opaque, not in terms of how it's functioning, but in terms of the logic and the rationale and the data inputs that are being put into it that's kept from from us, from the people, from understanding how these things function in a more like comprehensive or coherent way.
Just a quick comment on the question of the macro dimensions of this, which is a good question. I mean, the world isn't just going to be what happens in AI. The world is, there's the question of what's happening with finance. There's a question of economic instability. I just want to say that when we talk about control, it's not just a question of corporations. It's a system that is driving competitiveness, which forces certain kinds of decisions on around all technology and what happens in the workplace that are based on how do you compete. That's the value, which means that's why we have to challenge this whole system. It's a system. It's not just the greedy corporations. And the other thing is that AI is incredibly linked to the military. I mean, the drive of AI is both around competitiveness and the military. That's what the challenge with China is about. And AI, all this stuff couldn't exist. This is an industrial strategy. This isn't just kind of natural development. This is an industrial strategy that's involved massive funding from the military to develop certain kinds of technology that we should see as distorting, what human visions of what a good life is. So all these big questions come into it. And, are we going to have a bubble in AI with too much competition going on, and what's going to happen with that? What happens when something like deep chat, what's it called?
DeepSeek.
Deep what?
Doesn't matter.
DeepSeek. These are profound things that happen and throw things off whack in interesting ways. So it's not like, you just kind of project what's going on into the future. That's not how it's going to happen. And it's all the more reason why we have to be concerned about accepting a system which is operating that way.
Quickly, this point about AI being used to obscure decision making, I think that's already happening all the time, right? Very simple algorithms, like the example of computer programs being used to determine how much home health aid people with disabilities or long-term illnesses are allowed to have, rather than a nurse determining that, right? And then it's that decision making is obscured. The person just finds out, okay, I'm eligible for 10 hours per week, whereas before I was eligible for 30 when a nurse actually examined me and made that decision, right? So by never questioning this kind of system that we're putting in place, or these processes where we're allowing this decision making to be obscured, it puts us on the path of a much more sort of dangerous future, right? Where we are actually allowing an increasing number of decisions to be made by increasingly powerful models and systems. So I think that's why it's so important to really specify how it's being used to restructure work, right? So we can start to understand how it's being used in other spheres. But that being said, I think it's really important that we make a distinction between what we're talking about, right? When we're talking about work, or whether we're talking about geopolitics, right? Or whether we're talking about how the military is using these systems. Because this, when you read some of the manifestos of, some of the biggest proponents of AI, right, the military and competition and global competition is front and center. And they say, yes, maybe there are questions about whether we should be putting so much money and so many of our resources into this fast-forward race to develop the most powerful AGI, but if we don't do it, China will. So therefore, we have to. I mean, this is a very different conversation, and one that's, much more pressing, and one that we should really be having, rather than this kind of fantasy that tomorrow all of our jobs are going to disappear because they're going to be replaced by a computer program or a robot. So I think that that's a really important question. And this gets to the question of story, like storytelling and ideology. The reason why I was saying that a big part of sort of how we talk about AI is a story about AI is not that we aren't actually using it in very concrete ways to reorganize our lives and reorganize work, but to really get at the fundamental centrality of ideology in this framing, right? And the ways that the stories we tell about what's possible, right, really is shaped by the priorities of the institutions and people who are most powerful. Right, so if the stories we told were, and that's why I brought up the sort of Kurt Vonnegut story, right? Because that's a story where nothing goes well, and workers are completely powerless to resist the complete loss of their livelihoods and their identity as, you know, people who contribute to society, right? And today, I think it's as important as sort of pushing back to say we need to control the labor process, but also pushing back against the kind of technology stories that we hear, where there's nothing we can do to stop, you know, these processes, whether it's in the military or in the workplace, or there's nothing we can do to prevent our jobs from being degraded by automation and now digital technology. So I think that's really why. So it is partly about telling different stories, but also, you know, highlighting the very ideological nature of the current sort of dominant AI story, and I think that's important.
Thanks. Yeah. You get the idea.
Excellent.